David, how has America's view on terrorism changed since April 19, 1995?
April 19, 1995 was a seminal moment in the development of modern terrorism in this sense. Prior to 1995, the idea of mass casualties in terrorism was rejected. George Habaj, the head of the PFLP, said this about terrorism. He said, "Terrorism is a thinking man's game." By that he meant you kill only enough people to be taken seriously. McVeigh rejected that admonition and tried to kill hundreds of people, and in fact killed over 100 people. Bin Laden adopted the same strategy and tried to kill hundreds of thousands and killed thousands. They view us as a society averse to casualties. And if you see a society you believe is averse to casualties, the best way to get its attention is to kill in large numbers. A child falls down a well in Richardson, Texas, some other event happens. We as a nation hold our collective breath, and when the child's rescued, we breathe a collective sigh of relief. What makes us a decent people they perceive as a weakness, and hence mass casualty terrorism. And 1995 was the beginning of that.
Is domestic terrorism like that still a major concern in the United States?
After 1995, of course, Timothy McVeigh wanted to start the next American Revolution. Instead, what he did was he so horrified people by what he did, including people in the militias, that the more violent and agitating members of the group were marginalized. They had been in leadership positions until then, and they had been looked upon as the vanguard. But when the dead people started being removed from the Murrah building rubble, the sensible people in the militias, of which there were many, either rejected that notion of violence or left. What we're seeing now is a resurgence of the militias around issues like eminent domain and immigration. So the radical right is becoming more energized, more radical, and hence more dangerous.
What are the concerns about foreign groups operating on American soil right now?
Foreign groups operating on American soil are a reality. There are al-Qaeda cells or operatives here. Bob Mueller, the head of the FBI, said some time ago there probably are no sleeper cells. What he meant was we profiled sleeper cells, we know what they look like, we know what they do, and hence they've dispersed into operational networks.
What else can society do to minimize those kind of terrorist threats, at home and abroad?
I think at home the best model is the British Home Guard. During the Second World War, every Brit was looking for a saboteur or a spy. Now, I'm not suggesting we become a nation of people who watch one another with suspicion. But if you see something that's an anomaly in your neighborhood or where you live, if you see something unusual, I think it's incumbent upon you to call the authorities, let them sort it out. There's a very low threshold for response. You have to remember, there is no penalty for over-reporting. Under-reporting could bring a severe consequence.
Okay. Is America, and by extension Oklahoma, a safer place than it was in 1995?
America and Oklahoma are both safer. There's been so much good work done since 1995. The Joint Terrorism Task Forces, the FBI runs, collaborations of state and local law enforcement investigators, the analysis fusion centers, where information from all levels of law enforcement, as well as information from foreign sources, excuse me, is blended to identify terrorism warnings and indicators and allow us to intervene before something happens. Yes, we are better prepared, but the adversary remains dangerous and committed, and so we have to stay alert.
Okay. How much of a factor was the Oklahoma City bombing in the increased emphasis on prevention of terrorist attacks?
Following the 1995 tragedy, Louis Freeh, the former director of the FBI, was given 600 new agents to work nothing but domestic terrorism. And in the years that followed that, the FBI looked at, and the state and local law enforcement, important partners, looked at the militia groups. The challenge was, as I used to describe it, separating the dangerous from the merely silly. I mean, if you have men that go out every weekend and shoot at targets of, at that time it was Janet Reno, and claim the government is the enemy, and stockpile weapons, and bury food in the woods, and build berms, and crawl through the woods in their camis, none of which is illegal. As a rational society, we had to examine some of these groups and determine if they posed a threat, and that was the challenge. And the FBI and state and local law enforcement did a good job of that.
Okay. What changed in that effort after the terror attacks of 9/11?
After 9/11, there was almost a sea change, a profound, deep, and lasting change in the way law enforcement collaborates, the relationship between federal law enforcement and state and local, the integration of responders and police and other investigators, the emphasis on identifying terrorism warnings and indicators, additional intelligence tools. There have been a myriad of things that have happened since 9/11 to make us a safer place.
What still needs to be done to protect from further terrorist attacks?
My concern at this point is that we have reached our tolerance for security measures as a society. There's some pushback on the Patriot Act, on the NSA, quote, listening, unquote, program, all of which, in my view, are necessary to help us prevent terrorism. It's an exercise in the use of intelligence, and here's why. There are too many soft targets to protect by other means. If I'm a suicide bomber and I try and get into a nuclear power plant, I won't get in. I may get to the door, and as the guards and dogs are coming my way, if I detonate, I become nothing more than a custodial problem. Who's going to clean this person up? If I take that same suicide bomber and put him in the food court of a shopping mall on a Sunday afternoon, that's target displacement. There are too many soft targets. We must have a good intelligence process that lets us identify warnings and indicators and intervene. Now, we also must balance that with civil liberties. No one wants a perfectly intelligent, a perfectly efficient intelligence service. That was the Gestapo. We have to put inefficiencies in the way of our law enforcement to protect our liberty. But if we put too many inefficiencies in their way, they'll miss something. And if they miss something, people could die.
Is it possible to eradicate terrorism, or is that threat something we'll have to live with forever?
I think terrorism is a phenomenon that will be with us all the time. I think our victory will be when it is not the central national security concern of our nation, when we have marginalized terrorism, when most of the world repudiates it, and we have rejected both philosophically and practically the use of indiscriminate violence to make a point. Then I think that we will have, quote, won, unquote. But I think terrorism will be with us forever.
How does MIPT fit into that effort?
Well, the MIPT, of course, was born of the tragedy of the Murrah building bombing. It was the intention of the survivors and family members to create a living memorial that would look forward and help prevent terrorism. And since our birth, we have done hard science projects that have resulted in devices that are being used today in Afghanistan and Iraq to detect explosives. We have managed knowledge bases that are used by all levels of government to help understand terrorism. So that our contribution has been significant, and I think Oklahoma can be proud of it.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming in, David. I appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure.